Midnight, August 26, 1940. The sirens tore through Berlin's summer darkness like a wounded animal, screaming a warning no German thought they'd ever hear. Across the Reich capital, thousands of people bolted upright in their beds, hearts pounding, minds racing. Air raid sirens? Here? In Berlin? It had to be some kind of mistake. Some kind of drill. Because Hermann Göring himself, the Reich Marshal, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, had looked them in the eyes and made them a promise. An absolute ironclad, unbreakable promise. If an enemy aircraft reaches the Ruhr, Göring had declared, his chest drowning in medals, his face burning with absolute confidence. My name is not Hermann Göring. You can call me Meyer. Meyer. Let that sink in for a moment. A common German surname. Yes. But also, and here's where it gets deliciously ironic, a stereotypically Jewish name. For the Reich Marshal of the Third Reich, a man who'd helped architect the persecution of millions. To say, "Call me Meyer," was to stake everything. His reputation, his honor, his entire Nazi identity on one simple claim. No enemy bomber would ever reach Germany. And he hadn't said it just once. He'd said it over and over and over again. About the Ruhr. About German cities. About Berlin itself. Each time with that same chest-puffed arrogance, that same unshakable certainty. And the German people? They believed every single word. Why wouldn't they? The Luftwaffe had obliterated Poland in weeks. Crushed the Dutch Air Force like it was made of paper. Swept the Belgians aside, brought mighty France to its knees in just 6 weeks. German air superiority wasn't a boast anymore. It was a fact as solid and real as the massive concrete slabs of Hitler's new Reich Chancellery. But now, on this August night, the sirens were wailing. Searchlights stabbed upward into the darkness like desperate fingers, clawing at the clouds. And somewhere up there, hidden in that ink-black sky, British bombers were approaching the capital of what Hitler called his 1,000-year Reich. The promise made from a position of absolute power was about to shatter. Let's rewind for a second. Summer 1940. If you'd asked anyone in Europe who was going to win this war, the answer would have been obvious. Germany. Germany was unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Western Europe in a matter of weeks, rolling over countries like they were speed bumps. France had fallen. The supposedly impregnable Maginot Line? Bypassed and irrelevant. The French army, once considered the finest in Europe, defeated and humiliated. Only Britain remained isolated on its island. Seemingly helpless, seemingly finished. Hitler actually expected Churchill to pick up the phone and negotiate, to accept reality, to acknowledge German dominance and sue for peace. Any rational leader would have. Right? But Churchill? Churchill stood before Parliament and said something that must have seemed almost delusional at the time. We shall never surrender. Brave words. Powerful words. But also seemingly hollow words. What could Britain actually do? They'd just been kicked off the continent at Dunkirk. Their army battered, their allies defeated. What possible threat could they pose to the German war machine? Hitler and Göring had an answer. And a plan. Destroy the Royal Air Force. Achieve absolute air superiority over the English Channel. Then launch Operation Sea Lion. The amphibious invasion that would crush Britain once and for all. On paper, the math was brutally simple. The Luftwaffe had over 2,600 aircraft ready to go. The RAF's fighter command? Maybe 700 operational fighters. 2,600 versus 700. The Germans outnumbered the British nearly 4-1. Göring looked at those numbers and practically laughed. He assured Hitler it would take 4 days, to obliterate the RAF in southern England. 4 weeks to eliminate the entire British Air Force. 4 weeks. And Britain would be defenseless. The assault began in mid-July 1940. German bombers escorted by swarms of fighters attacked British shipping in the Channel. Then coastal targets. Then the RAF airfields themselves. The strategy was textbook military doctrine. Destroy the RAF on the ground, wreck their runways, crater their airfields, shoot down their fighters in the air. Make Britain defenseless from above. Then invade from the sea. And here's the terrifying thing, it was working. Through late July and into August, RAF fighter command was being ground into dust. British pilots were flying 4, sometimes 5 sorties a day. They'd land with hands shaking so badly from exhaustion they could barely hold a cup of tea. And before their Spitfires and Hurricanes had even cooled down, they were climbing back into the cockpits and going up again. Airfields were being pounded into moonscapes by German bombs. Radar stations. Britain's technological edge were being damaged and destroyed. Fighter production couldn't keep pace with the losses. Hugh Dowding, the quiet, methodical commander of RAF Fighter Command, was watching his force bleed to death. He knew better than anyone that Britain was perhaps 2 weeks away from total collapse. But then Hitler made a decision that would change everything. He gave strict orders to his air force. Do not bomb London. Not yet. He wanted to keep the option of negotiation open. He wanted to avoid provoking British retaliation against German cities. He wanted, and this is almost funny in hindsight, to maintain the moral high ground. The Luftwaffe was to focus exclusively on military targets. Airfields, factories, ports. London with its millions of civilians was completely off limits. August 24, 1940. A night that would change history. German bombers, perhaps lost in the darkness, perhaps confused by British defenses, perhaps just making a terrible navigation error, dropped bombs on central London. The damage was relatively minor. A few buildings destroyed, some civilians killed, but the symbolism? Enormous. Churchill had been waiting, almost hoping for exactly this moment. The next day he immediately ordered retaliation, but not against military targets, against Berlin. The RAF had been conducting small raids against German industrial sites for months. But Berlin? Berlin had remained untouched, too distant from most British bombers, too well defended, too symbolic to risk the embarrassment of failure. Now, Churchill didn't care about the cost. If the Germans would bomb London, the British would bomb Berlin. The strategic value was questionable at best. The RAF's twin-engine bombers, Wellingtons and Hamptons, would struggle to reach Berlin carrying any meaningful bomb load. The distance was extreme, the navigation challenging, the defenses unknown. But the psychological value? Priceless. Night of August 25th. 81 RAF bombers took off from bases scattered across England, heading east across the dark North Sea. Each one carried perhaps 1,000 pounds of bombs. Not much, but enough. Many turned back with mechanical problems. Others got lost in the darkness. But 29 British bombers actually reached Berlin. Hildegard Neff, a young woman who would later become one of Germany's most famous actresses, was asleep in her apartment when the sirens began. She would later describe the sound as unreal, impossible. She went to her window. Searchlights swept the sky. Anti-aircraft guns thumped in the distance. And then unmistakably the crump of explosions. Not close, but close enough. British bombs falling on Berlin. The raid lasted about an hour. The bombs scattered across the city, hitting residential areas in the northern and eastern districts, a railway line, a dairy. The damage was minimal. Incredibly, no one was killed in this first raid. But the psychological impact? Absolutely devastating. Germans emerged from shelters confused, angry, disbelieving. How had this happened? Where was the Luftwaffe? Where were the promised defenses? Where was Göring's guarantee? William Shirer, the American journalist stationed in Berlin, watched it all unfold. He noted in his diary, "The Berliners are stunned. They did not think it could happen." The next morning he watched people gathering in the streets, staring at the bomb damage, speaking in low, almost whispered voices. The state of shock was palpable. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, immediately went into overdrive, trying to minimize the raid. The damage was insignificant, he said. Only a few bombs, no military targets hit. The British were wasting their effort. But Goebbels couldn't hide the one central, inescapable fact. British bombers had reached Berlin. Göring's promise was broken. And where was the Reich Marshal himself during this humiliation? Not in Berlin defending his capital. He was lounging at Carenhall, his massive estate north of the city, surrounded by his looted art collection and, I'm not making this up, his pet lions. When someone finally worked up the courage to tell him about the raid, Göring reportedly exploded in rage. He blamed the fighter command. He demanded explanations. He screamed for heads to roll. But the explanation was brutally simple. Berlin was at the extreme range of British bombers. Yes, but not impossible to reach. The city's defenses, while substantial, were not impenetrable, and the RAF, desperate and determined, was willing to accept staggering losses to strike back. The British came again on August 28th. This time they hit the city center. A bomb landed near the Brandenburg Gate. Another struck close to the Reich Chancellery itself, Hitler's headquarters. The Führer wasn't there. But the message was crystal clear. The British could strike at the very heart of the Reich. More raids followed. August 31st, September 1st, September 3rd. Each time the actual damage was relatively light. The RAF simply couldn't deliver massive bomb loads at that extreme range. But each raid was another humiliation. Another contradiction of everything the German people had been told, another crack in the facade of invincibility. Hitler had been at his mountain retreat, the Berghof in Bavaria, when the first raids occurred. When he returned to Berlin in early September, those who saw him said he was in a state of cold, barely controlled fury. The British had bombed his capital. They had humiliated Göring. They had made him, the Führer, look weak, and they had done it deliberately, knowing it would provoke him, practically daring him to respond. September 4th, 1940. The Sport Palace in Berlin. Hitler stood before an audience of primarily women, nurses, social workers, party functionaries. The speech was broadcast across all of Germany. Hitler's voice, initially controlled and measured, began to rise. When he addressed the British raids, it climbed to an absolute shriek. When the British Air Force drops 2 or 3 or 4,000 kilograms of bombs, then we will in one night drop 150, 230, 300 or 400,000 kilograms. The crowd erupted, roaring approval. Hitler's voice cracked with rage as he continued. When they declare that they will increase their attacks on our cities, then we will raise their cities to the ground. The audience went absolutely wild. Women wept, screamed, raised their arms in salute. Hitler fed on their energy like a vampire, his voice climbing higher and higher. We will stop the handiwork of these night air pirates. So help us God. The hour will come when one of us will break, and it will not be National Socialist Germany. The crowd chanted in unison. Führer, we follow. Hitler's decision was made. He would erase British cities from the map. He would make them pay for their insolence. And he would start with London. Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe Field Marshal commanding air operations in the West, received his orders on September 5th. The directive was devastatingly clear. Cease all attacks on RAF airfields. Shift every available bomber to London. Begin sustained terror bombing of the British capital. The goal was no longer military. It was to break British civilian morale, to create such chaos and suffering that Churchill's government would collapse under the weight of public desperation. Kesselring, a professional soldier, a military strategist, understood the implications immediately, and they horrified him. For weeks his forces had been systematically destroying RAF fighter command. The British were on the absolute edge of collapse. Several key airfields in southern England were nearly non-operational. Dowding's pilot losses were catastrophically unsustainable. Fighter command was perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less, from total disintegration. If the pressure continued, Britain's air defense would simply cease to exist. But Kesselring was a soldier in a dictatorship. Hitler had given an order. Göring, desperate to restore his shattered reputation, enthusiastically supported it. The Luftwaffe would bomb London. September 7, 1940. Late afternoon. Londoners heard a sound unlike anything they'd ever experienced before. A deep rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder and louder and louder. Over 300 German bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, approached the city in broad daylight. The formations literally darkened the sky. RAF fighters rose to meet them, but the sheer scale was overwhelming. There were simply too many. The bombers reached London's East End, the docks, the warehouses, the densely packed working-class neighborhoods where families lived crammed together in rows of wooden houses. The bombs fell in waves, high explosives and incendiaries. The docks erupted into towering walls of flame. Fire spread through the streets like a living thing, consuming everything. By nightfall, much of East London was a blazing inferno. The flames were visible for miles, a beacon guiding the next wave of bombers that arrived after dark. The raid continued all night. When the sun finally rose, over 400 Londoners were dead. Thousands more were injured. Tens of thousands were homeless. their entire lives reduced to ash and rubble. The Blitz had begun. For the next 57 consecutive nights, German bombers would attack London, then other cities: Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester. The bombing would eventually kill over 40,000 British civilians before it finally ended in May 1941. The devastation was real. The suffering was immense and horrifying. And here's the twist that Hitler never saw coming. RAF Fighter Command, given breathing room by the sudden shift away from their airfields, survived. Damaged bases were repaired. New pilots completed their training. Aircraft production continued and even accelerated. And the Luftwaffe, now focused on terror bombing instead of strategic targeting, was wasting its strength on an objective that was militarily meaningless. Bombing cities at night was far less effective than destroying military infrastructure in daylight. The loss rates for German bombers were similar, but the strategic return was virtually zero. You can kill civilians, but that doesn't win wars. You win wars by destroying your enemy's ability to fight back. Hugh Dowding, exhausted and facing criticism for his defensive tactics, would be removed from command in November 1940. Politics and bureaucracy are cruel even in wartime. But his strategy had worked. Fighter Command had held. Britain had survived. By late September, it became crystal clear that Germany could not achieve air superiority over Britain. Operation Sea Lion was postponed, then quietly, almost embarrassingly, abandoned. The invasion would never happen. The Battle of Britain was over. Britain had won, not through superior numbers, not through better equipment, but by surviving long enough for Hitler to make a catastrophic mistake. And that mistake? It had been triggered by Hermann Göring's arrogant promise, by German pride, by the desperate need to respond to those small British bombs falling on Berlin. In the months that followed, as the Blitz continued, but the strategic situation stabilized, German military leaders began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. The shift to terror bombing had been an emotional decision, not a strategic one. Hitler had let his rage override military logic. Göring had supported it to save face. And the Luftwaffe, the once invincible Luftwaffe, had paid an enormous price. Kesselring, in his post-war memoir, was diplomatic but painfully clear. The decision to switch targets had been a mistake, a catastrophic mistake. The RAF had been on the verge of total collapse. We had them, one Luftwaffe officer said years later, the bitterness still fresh in his voice. And then we let them go. Göring? Göring never publicly acknowledged the failure of his promise, never admitted he'd been wrong. He blamed the fighter pilots for not protecting the bombers. He blamed British luck. He blamed weather, timing, fate, everything except his own arrogance. But privately, his influence with Hitler began to fade like morning mist. The Reich Marshal, who had promised that no bomb would ever fall on Berlin, had been proven spectacularly, publicly, humiliatingly wrong. And in the Third Reich, being proven wrong by the Führer's enemies was absolutely unforgivable. The German public learned to live with the air raids. Berlin would be bombed again and again as the war ground on, with increasing intensity, increasing devastation. By 1943, RAF Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force would be dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German cities in single raids. Raids that made those first small attacks of August 1940 seem almost quaint by comparison. Germans learned to sleep in shelters, to navigate streets turned into landscapes of rubble, to live with constant grinding, inescapable fear. The promise of invulnerability was forgotten, or rather remembered only as a bitter joke whispered in the darkness. "Call me Meyer," Göring had said. By the end of the war, with German cities in ruins and the Luftwaffe destroyed, some Germans did call him that, quietly, bitterly, a reminder of the hubris that had helped cost them everything. The irony was perfect and terrible. Hitler had ordered the bombing of London to avenge the bombing of Berlin, to restore German pride, to punish British insolence, to show the world that Germany could not be defied. But that decision, made in white-hot rage, had saved Britain's Air Force and lost Germany its best, its only chance to invade and defeat Britain. The bombs that fell on Berlin in August 1940, scattered, ineffective, barely damaging, had triggered a chain of events that fundamentally changed the course of the entire war. Churchill understood this perfectly. In his post-war history, written with the satisfaction of a man who'd seen his gamble pay off, He wrote about the German shift to London with barely concealed glee. The RAF had been in desperate straits, he acknowledged. But Hitler's decision to switch targets was a turning point. The moment the tide began to turn, the Luftwaffe had abandoned a strategy that was working, for one that merely looked dramatic and felt satisfying. And it had all started with a promise. A promise made with absolute confidence by a man in a ridiculous uniform covered in medals. A man who swore on his honor, on his name, on everything he represented, that British bombs would never fall on German soil. The promise was broken on August 26, 1940. 29 RAF bombers reached Berlin and dropped their loads on the capital of the Reich. The actual damage? Minimal. A few buildings, a railway line, a dairy. The strategic consequences? Absolutely enormous. In the end, the Battle of Britain wasn't decided by superior British tactics or technology. It was decided by German pride and German rage. Göring's promise created an expectation that couldn't possibly be met. Hitler's fury at its breaking led to a strategic blunder of almost incomprehensible magnitude. And Britain, battered, bleeding, exhausted, but unbroken, survived to fight on. Those sirens that wailed over Berlin that August night were more than just a warning of falling bombs. They were the sound of German invincibility shattering, the sound of a promise broken, the sound of a war that would now take a very, very different course. The British had proven that Berlin could be reached, and in proving it, they had saved themselves. Sometimes the smallest actions trigger the largest consequences. 29 bombers, carrying barely 30 tons of bombs between them, changed the fate of the entire war, because they didn't just hit buildings in Berlin, they hit Hermann Göring's pride, and that turned out to be the most valuable target of all.